everybody. Good evening for those who are in other parts of the world. I am Luis Augusto de Castro Neves. I'm president of the Brazil-China Business Council, and we are about to discuss in our seminar about decoding Beijing's planned expectations for the Chinese economy in 2024. As you know, in mid-March, the two sessions, or Lianghui in Mandarin, were concluded. It is known as was one of the most important moments in Beijing's political calendar. The two sessions marked the moment where thousands of government officials and members of the Chinese society defined the country's main objectives for the current year, such as guidelines for economic and financial policies, technological development, sustainability initiatives, social development, and national security. Needless to say that we are living very unstable times. We are in the midst of a transition of international order, and no idea what the new structure will be, but what we can see now is that the present architecture of international institutions is unable to deal with localized problems such as Gaza and the war in Ukraine. They are local problems, but they have international consequences. And this webinar, organized in partnership between China Business Council, Brazil-China Business Council, and the Brazilian Center for International Relations, the CEBC, we invite specialists from various countries and fields of study to debate the current state of Chinese politics, as well as the key takeaways from this year's two sessions, in a constant context of considerable economic challenges for Beijing and for President Xi Jinping's leadership. Well, having said that, I now pass the floor to Cláudia Trevisan, Executive Director of the Brazil-China Business Council and moderator of today's events, so she can present our guests and explain the dynamics of the seminar. Well, thank you,
Ambassador.
And Cláudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good morning and good evening to our panelists and to all of us who are following us online. Our main goal today is to interpret the signals and messages that the Chinese government sent during the two sessions and try to understand what they mean for China and the world. To do that, we have a panel of experts currently in different parts of the world. We hope to have Professor Wang Yiwei, Senior Fellow of the Taipei Institute and Director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University of China. He's at the Boao Forum, and I hope he will join us shortly. From Norway, we have Erlend Ek, lead energy in the energy sector of the research company China Policy. And from the United States, we have Itamar Waksman, macroeconomic analyst at the China Policy. After their presentation, we'll hear comments from Larissa Wachholz, senior fellow at CEBC and partner of Vallya. Larissa is in Brasilia and I am in Rio. Each panelist and Larissa will have around 8 minutes to their remarks. I will then start the Q&A session. If you wish to raise a session, please use the Zoom Q&A tool that you can find on the lower bar of your screen. So let's begin. Since Professor Wang is not with us yet, we will start with Erlend from Norway. Erlend, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cláudia. Let me try to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see it now. Yes, so I will be emphasizing the importance of seeing the development in China as part of a larger doctrinal pursuit. In the 1980s, I mean, maybe I actually need to maybe this is better. Oh, there you go. So yeah, in the 1980s, China had the idea of slowly but surely introduce market forces and be part of the bigger global market and move to a promised land of wealth and power. Then a new normal appeared after the global financial crisis, and by 2014, a more uncertain stage appeared. At the time, we at China Policy called this trapeze economics because China was looking for new growth drivers, but didn't really know what they were. So we were living a bit more uncertain time. But since 2020, deeper thinking of both making the old land more sustainable and promising, while also creating sustainable dynamic with the rest of the world has emerged. And I think this is a very significant doctrinal shift, emphasizing the quality of multiple dimensions beyond mere economic growth. Yeah. A whole set of new buzzwords and concepts have recently emerged and were very much present at the two sessions. These are not simply slogans, but often refer to a set of theories. And they are all pointing to the same goal, which is a modern and powerful socialist country. So this is not about making China just powerful and wealthy for the sake of it, but they're trying to define a clearer goal. And I don't think that we have seen the full picture of what that really is yet. But my main message today is that the outcome of the two sessions align with our expectations to solidify this new development paradigm. The top task of the government work report is usually to steer the macroeconomy. But this year it was not. Instead, fostering new productive forces, one of the buzzwords on the previous slide, and modernizing industry ranks first. Invigorating China through science and education was the second, and the third was expanding domestic demand, the top goal of 2023. So the Chinese state is following it through, and it's committing 371 billion to science and technology, and that is up 10% from last year. And we have seen a massive shift in loans from the real estate sector towards the industry sector over the last couple of years, since this new development philosophy was articulated. And a very important new feature of this goal is that the government or governance system now tries to work together, not in silos. The government work report talks up cohesive policy with combination effects, integrating innovation, industry, education, capital, and talent. So previous work reports usually disperse these elements sector by sector. Premier Li Qiang remarked, combination effects require more consistent policymaking. And the point here is to break bureaucratic silos and better integrate economic and social policy. NDRC has been, for the last few months, also talked about this topic, saying that we need to have all policy fit within the same macro direction. What does this mean for China's global interests and engagements? I think it's important to note that China's heightened priority on self-reliance and innovation will not make China isolated and self-sufficient. It is important to acknowledge that it was deep-seated challenges at home and abroad that forced China to think differently and come up with a new strategy that can be called, or they call, the new development philosophy. From the Chinese leadership's point of view, the point is not now to move from supporting the supply side of the economy and start supporting the demand side. The role of the government should be to ensure and facilitate the country's ability to innovate. And with time, the plan is to introduce market forces to handle the supply-demand relationship. With this, domestic prices for input factors such as energy and food are likely to rise with domestic market reforms, making international products more attractive. But this transformation to a market-led system is not likely to be fully in play before 2035. Before then, China are in the global market to find a diverse mix of long-term and strategic partners. And with that, I leave the word back to you, Cláudia.
Thank you so much, Erlend. I will pass the floor now to Itamar. Itamar, welcome to our seminar.
Yes, thank you very much, Cláudia, and good morning and good evening to everyone who's watching. My presentation is going to be very similar to Erlend's, but he took a wider angle, and I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on what is going on right at this moment. So, what kind of expectations can we have this year for 2024? And I think the question that has really dominated the foreign press, at least, is why are they not simply expanding consumption to stimulate the economy? And I actually think recently the economist Liu Yuanchun, who is very close to the leadership and regularly speaks to them, said it very succinctly. He said that sustained growth and the potential to continue growing relies on the supply side. This is really fundamental to understanding the thinking of the leadership in the PRC. And the supply side's development, especially through technology and industrial upgrading. And he said that consumption, investment, and exports, they only can express the results of current micro behavior. So this is really the backdrop to everything that the leadership is doing in relation to all macro policy and all policy in total, really. And we have more background that currently the state is facing, in its own words, limited resources. So during the government work report, as well as other meetings that occurred during the two sessions, and even before that, there's been talk about the need to pass, tight fiscal days. So there's an understanding that there are limited resources that have to be allocated efficiently, and that possibly using them on increasing consumption is not efficient. Also, real estate decline means that a short-term expansion consumption is unlikely. We've seen that households have increased their deposits over the past 2 years, and that is because their wealth is taking a hit as stock markets decline and real estate's value declines as well. So putting more money in their pockets won't necessarily result in it going back to the economy. It might just go back into their deposits. And really, the emergence of this term, new productive forces, which exploded after a Politburo study session in late January and was really prevalent at the two sessions, really describes this forward-looking supply side focus. So just some macro expectations that we have this year in the PRC is real estate prices are going to continue to decline. There's talk about them having to decline 20 to maybe 40% from their peak, even though construction and investment is likely to stabilize. That was really one of the most interesting expectations we got out of the government's budget. They think that the income from land sales is going to stabilize. Growth is going to be sustained by historic investments in strategic emerging industries and future industries, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And fiscal taxation reform is necessary to secure local government solvency. This is a big problem right now at the local level and is really at the root of the debt crisis there. And it's also important to keep in mind that there is an ongoing process of restructuring capital going on right now in the PRC. And, the leadership has been talking about the need to guide capital ever since 2021, at least. But really last year in March, with the creation of the party's Central Financial Commission, which took high-level financial decision-making and design back into a party commission and away from the People's Bank of China, the central bank, that really kind of sent the message that some wider and deeper reforms were happening. And some things that we've already seen policy documents on this year and last year are really big efforts to channel bank credit into innovative firms. This has been a problem that the PRC has been trying to solve. It's one of the reasons that the stock market is so important, because it is a way for them to fund these future industry leaders. So now we're going to see a lot of experimentation this year with trying to get bank credit to these innovative firms. That's why we see lots of efforts, especially in the first few months of this year, to try to get the stock markets back to health and functioning well and prices going up, because the leadership sees stock markets as an essential tool to funding these future innovative firms. And the government work report was very clear that they're going to try to get industrial funds to improve. So from the graph that we see on the screen, the proliferation and growth of government guidance funds, which are, you can think of as government-led, private equity funds, basically. They've grown a lot over the past decade, but they've had a lot of issues being able to fund the most innovative companies, and that is something that the leadership is working on this year. And the last thing is SOEs have been called upon to complement this innovation drive. So, for example, a third of all R&D spending is...
Julio, seu microfone está aberto. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So about a third of R&D spending in the PRC is done by state-owned enterprises. So they are a huge part of this drive to become this innovation-based economy. And the last thing that I think is especially relevant to people like the audience is a lot of re-engineering going around the foreign-domestic connection. There is a lot of talk in the government work report and before about high-level openness. And we've actually seen a lot of advancements in this and developments in this over the two sessions. So there was a widening of market access in services like healthcare and also in manufacturing, which the leadership had been tentative about for a long time. And then right after the government work report, or the two sessions, it is notable that the State Council immediately released an action plan on foreign investment. So they're taking high-level openness and opening their markets to investment and to trade very, very seriously. And that's really coupled with these efforts over the last few years to build a unified national market where there is more free competition and fair competition, including for foreign firms. But I think the part that for us is the most interesting is this prospect of, as China moves up the value-added chain in global supply chains, that there's a lot of talk right now in the PRC about expanding supply chains internationally. And we are really seeing this. I mean, for example, the kind of investments that BYD is making in Brazil, building the continent's first electric vehicle plant, for example, in, I believe, Bahia, as well as the kind of talks that the PRC government agencies as well as private companies are having with Saudi investors, for example, to kind of exchange Saudi investments in the PRC for building research and manufacturing facilities in Saudi Arabia, helping them diversify their economy. I think these kind of create the prospect of a really, really changed global economic system. And of course, talk about a Green Silk Road and the kind of investments that China is doing in green energy around the world, especially in Africa so far. These are starting to show the signs of how the world is going to change in the coming decades as a result of the PRC becoming the preeminent manufacturing, possibly becoming the preeminent manufacturing country in the world. So these are some thoughts I wanted to leave the audience with today, and I will go ahead and hand it back to you, Cláudia. Thank you.
Thank you, Itamar. We have a lot of things to talk about, but before we initiate the Q&A section, I'd like to pass the floor to Larissa. Larissa, thank you for the partnership in this webinar.
Thank you, Cláudia. It's really good to be among friends in this panel today. I think what Itamar just said about the supply chain expansion of Chinese firms internationally is probably one of the topics that is most interesting for a country like Brazil. Like, of course, both aspects of trade and investment are very relevant for us. China is our main trade partner. We have a lot of challenges in our trade relationship, and we have to really ask ourselves as a country what to do so that we can add value to our trade with China. We're basically exporting commodities. But I have a feeling that most of the challenges of adding value to this production remains with us. It's a challenge regarding the Brazilian economy, and the question is, how can we make ourselves more competitive so that our products with more added value will make sense to China? Because from what Itamar shows and from what we've seen through the past few years, China is basically open to international markets, both as an importer as well as an exporter. And we see the potential to export to China a lot of different products, as long as we are competitive enough to place our product and convince buyers to buy our brands. So it has a lot to do with our own ability to grow internationally. On the other hand, Brazil is on a key part of its history, maybe, that as the world faces the ecological transition, Brazil has the opportunity of placing itself as a destination for investments of industrial farms that are energy intensive and that need to decarbonize their production chains, their supply chains. So because of Brazil's ability to produce clean energy at a cheap cost or a competitive cost, I think it's hard to listen to me. Somebody said that. Maybe it's because I don't have a lot of a voice today. I'll try to speak louder. I'm a bit sick, sorry, Reinaldo. Brazil has the potential to attract industries, industrial firms that will find a strategic advantage of locating their production in a place with these features. So Brazil is already a country with a big potential for that already generates a lot of clean energy, but the potential is there for us to go even further. So when I hear Itamar's comments on China internationalizing its supply chain and the green belt and road, and even if we take out the belt and road itself, but the fact that it is green, and I think nobody questions China's commitment to green and to carbon neutrality, I think all that signifies that Brazil and China have a future ahead that will be very focused on the ecological transition, the energy transition, and the fact that we might be able to attract such investments. And I'm not saying that Brazil would produce here to export back to China, but what I'm saying is that in the case of fertilizers, we have this huge need. We import about 90% of our fertilizer needs, our fertilizer consumption. And this is a very energy intensive sector. If we can produce ammonia here in Brazil on the basis of green hydrogen, for instance, China could be an investor to these sectors, both because it is capital intensive, but also because of technology. It's technology intensive as well. And Brazil is a major user of this product, but our neighboring countries could be as well, like Argentina. And there are other cases in which, if you talk about green steel, for instance, that Brazil could be a consumer, but the region could be a consumer of green steel, as well as even Europe or the US. So the power shoring ability that Brazil could have to attract these investments, I think it's something that talks about the future of this relationship. And I think we should try to take advantage of that. One discussion, one issue that is taking place in Brazil at the moment is whether we should focus on trying to develop the production chain so that we can have the production of solar panels in Brazil that will stimulate the clean energy production and go up the value chain, or if we just should just conform to importing the panels, but focusing on our ability to produce energy, clean energy, at the most competitive price available. And that's a very interesting discussion that I think we will have to have here in Brazil. Like, do we want to produce solar panels? Should we focus on that? Or should we focus on our ability to get the equipment as cheap as possible so that we can take on the next step and be producers of green fertilizer and green steel and sustainable aviation fuels and maritime fuels, all of those industries that will need to reallocate around the world so that they can be closer to their consumer markets. And they are energy intensive, and they are also capital intensive, and are also tech intensive. So I think from a Brazilian perspective, this is a view to the future of where we could focus, we could aim at, especially because it's a special year for Brazil-China relations. We celebrate 50 years of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries. So we have a lot of opportunities for getting together, for discussing and for taking policy suggestions to decision makers. And it seems to me that this is one track that we should keep in mind. So as much as China is successful on their strategy, I think Brazil will benefit from it, as it has been in the past years. So Brazil is a country that has benefited a lot from Chinese growth. And the more successful China can be in its growth, we will also keep benefiting from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Larissa. And I think you gave me a path to my first question, which is related to the potential of Brazil-China relationship. I think it was Itamar that said that China is looking for expand production chains outside China. And Erlend said that China is looking for new partners. So in this context, how you both see Brazil-China relations? Which are the areas where Brazil has a potential to attract Chinese production chains, and how Brazil is positioned when China looks to the world now in terms of new partnerships, how China sees Brazil and how well Brazil is positioned to develop a deeper partnership with China. So it's a question for two of us. Who would like to start?
Maybe I'll go first, and Itamar can continue on my thought. Maybe I think, and let me say that it was very interesting to hear Larissa, because I think this is exactly how you should be thinking when it comes to China. Strategic is the key word. Other countries are also waking up to this, but China has been strategically developing industries and trade for at least 25 years now. and they are very successful in the list of industries that identified as strategic emerging industries 25 years ago, which includes new energy vehicles, renewable energy, and so on. But I would say that obviously there is also these traditional industries, traditional products, traditional services that still will be important, at least in the near term. And then I think what Larissa said about trying to find Brazil's own strategy is the key, how to think about transition. Let me just say a bit of how China is currently seeing the world developing. So around 5 to 10 years ago, China identified that there is a revolutionary industrial revolution going on with all these, and especially when it comes to AI, big data, and these kind of technologies. And these are not only new technologies, these are fundamental technologies in the future economy of the world. So the way you organize the society needs to change. You can't have the relationship between the market and the state is going to change. And China has been preparing for that for a few years already. And you can see that other countries are also experiencing the same discussions. What is the relation between the state and the market? What should the market players be doing? And the state role is a key one here, I think. The state needs to identify what kind of economy do we want to have in the future? What kind of industries should we be doing? For most countries in the world, this would be to pick a few winners. China, on the other hand, obviously has picked them all. I think that there are 500 products in the world where China has a global share of more than 40%. So they have the luxury because of their population, because of their demand to kind of pick it all, and they will do well in some and poorly in others. Of course, the transition for other countries are more difficult. So I guess this is what I would say in terms of how Brazil should think about this, is how do you play together with China? What advantages can you reap from this relationship? But it's very key that you have this strategy yourself. Maybe Itamar want to add a few points.
Yeah, I think what you said is exactly right. And I think in this particular case, this is a situation where states do have to lead, because the question of what kind of industries are going to move to other countries and at what pace is to a certain extent going to be decided politically. And even though Chinese firms, private firms, state-owned firms might decide to move some forms of manufacturing like BYD did, just because it wanted to have a foothold in the region, and Brazil is a great place to have that, and there are many advantages to producing in Brazil. If we look at the situation geopolitically that the PRC is in today, it is looking at this expansion of the supply chain not purely as an economic problem, but also as a way of reshaping the world economy to kind of secure itself as, we could say, the confrontation with Europe and the United States grows, right? So I think it's important for a country like Brazil, for example, to try to, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but to leverage this situation, this reality, and use it to its advantage to actually see if it can get more technology to be transferred to Brazil. Because really, that is the key for a country like Brazil, who is trying to industrialize and to increase its productivity. It needs to bring in technology. And one of the problems that we have seen over the past 50 years or so of world economic history is that the countries that have the technology, namely Japan, Europe, and the United States, are not very willing to transfer it to the rest of the world. But the difference with the PRC is that they have shown in many examples a demonstrated willingness to do that. So I think that should really be the key from the perspective of a country like Brazil.
Thank you, Itamar. Larissa.
Thank you, Cláudia. I just wanted to jump in and add one element that I think it's quite interesting from Erlend's perspective on China looking for new partners, which is the BRICS expansion. And I think Wang Yi mentioned the BRICS like in one of his talks during the two sessions. And what I find it interesting is that the expansion was large, but the idea is how can we benefit the most from it? I think, again, looking at it from a strategic perspective, we have Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, two of the most active countries in terms of institutional funds nowadays. We're talking about industries that are very costly, like those investments are all capital intensive. So we should probably look at this situation of the BRICS expansion as an opportunity for us to be closer with partners such as those. Can we have a relationship with them close enough on a bilateral basis, even if we're not part of the BRICS? Yes, we can. However, the BRICS will give us additional opportunities for convening, for getting together, for the leaders to meet. And every time they meet, there will be a need, let's say, to present positive agendas, right? So how can we take the most out of it? So out of China's need and active search for partners and countries around the world that it can work together on a positive basis, and the fact that Brazil is part of a group that China values and that has members with the pockets that are big enough for them to be important institutional investors, right? And also that have themselves the need to decarbonize economies that are very much based on traditional energies. So I think, again, there are strategic ways to look into these interactions that can be very interesting for Brazil. It all depends on how we place it. And I just think we should keep that in our minds, that in the end, it is an opportunity.
Yes, yes, I agree, for sure. We're talking a lot about long-term trends, no structural change. I'd like to raise a question that is very short-term focused, and I'll make the same question for you three. And it is, will China be able to reach the 5% growth, economic growth set by this year, and why?
I'll leave this to you, Itamar.
Yeah. This is always such an interesting question. The truth is that if they set the target, they have many means to ensure that they reach it, right? Because something that many of us may not understand well, and even someone like me who works in this every single day, is that the state's kind of control, I don't want to say control, its embeddedness within the financial system, in the PRC, is something that has no parallel in the world. So the state's ability to channel financing to different sectors and to control the level of investment in the country is unparalleled. So if they want to grow at 5%, I think they can. Now, let's see. A lot of people have been talking about that growth is going to be more difficult this year because last year there was a base effect. The economy had grown more slowly in 2022 due to the COVID lockdowns and other reasons. And because of that low base effect, it was easier, quote unquote, to grow last year. But I think this year, there are a lot of potential forces that are going to improve. First, I think that household consumption is going to improve this year. And that's because really at the root, as I talked about during my presentation, household consumption, though it has been growing since the end of the pandemic restrictions, confidence is still a bit low. And that's mostly because of this structural readjustment that's occurring in the real estate sector. and the decline in prices that are causing households, especially households with more money, to feel like they are not comfortable spending a lot at the moment. But I think as time moves by and this real estate adjustment becomes more institutionalized, and people realize that this is not just something that is happening simply because of market forces, but is actually part of the state's overall economic engineering, that they're going to be more willing to spend. So I think household consumption will improve this year. And I think that investment is also going to continue to increase, especially in advanced manufacturing. That is sort of the whole point of all of this talk surrounding new productive forces. I think it's important for our audience to understand that these kind of terms that appear in the PRC, these doctrinal terms, new productive forces, for example, the new growth paradigm, their purpose is to send signals to cadres and as well to enterprises on all levels that you need to focus on this, right? It creates a framework in order for the center in Beijing to coax other levels of society to go towards kind of one unified macro direction. So I think we're going to see a lot more investment in these sectors. Consumption, I think, will improve. The decline in real estate, I think, is going to start slowing down. And I believe they will be able to hit the 5% growth target if they want. But I will add just one last thing, which is that there's all this talk about the need for high growth, but the reality is that even moderate levels of growth over the next decade are going to turn the PRC into a high income and advanced manufacturing country. So at the current moment, they're setting the 5% growth target really as a way of managing society's expectations. But this isn't a number that they exactly need. I think even lower levels of growth at the end will result in the kind of society that the leadership is trying to engineer.
Great, thank you. And also the question of the size that the Chinese economy had today, It's one thing to have 5% growth with an $18 trillion economy, and another thing to have 5% growth in an economy that is half the size. If China grows 5%, it will add at least 2 Argentinas to its economy this year. So it's not a negligible thing. Larissa, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I just would like to add to what Itamar said, that it just becomes harder also to grow at higher rates when you are already a large economy. So it seems to me that it's a bit it's an idea that is just a misconcept, and it's also a bit surprising that people keep being very surprised about these numbers after so many years that the Chinese government has been talking about their intention to grow at a more moderate rate. The easy gains of productivity that you have with the rural urban migration and the beginning of China's reform and opening up process are obviously not there anymore. So we're talking about a different countries, but this country has been different for a number of years already. So I'm still surprised by how much people seem to be surprised by these figures.
Yes, and the Chinese government has been talking about transitioning to a different growth model for quite a long time, And I think this question of transitioning from high quantity growth to high quality growth, so have a slower pace of growth, but with higher quality, something that has been in the agenda for quite some time. Erlend, sorry.
Yeah, let me just add a few more points. One is that China's population has peaked and is now declining more than 10 million a year. I think that is also quite notable. That's twice the size of Norway, twice the size of the population of Norway every year. That obviously also has an impact on the demand. But my other point is that I think that the growth drivers of China are going to be very different moving forward, but also in the world. I think traditionally, the way that China likes to look at this is through labor, the input of labor, capital, technology. But this new value of data, and especially AI, and how this is going to impact growth, I think China is now trying to understand that they are changing the way that they organize their economy accordingly. In a few years, they expect that the growth pattern is going to be very, very different than the past. And maybe you want to talk a little bit more about this also, Itamar, because I know you have really deep insight on this.
Well, I guess just for the sake of time, the PRC over the last kind of 7 months or so, they've been releasing a lot of policy documents to develop, especially what they call data assets. So they believe in actually harnessing the economic value of data and turning it into another asset class like securities or property or something like that, so that it can actually fully realize this economic potential. And we've seen a lot of developments relating to that very recently, and we expect that this year that is something that is going to come more. And the estimates are really wide, but I mean, there really could be trillions and trillions of US dollars worth of data assets that could be created just over the next 5 years or so. So the kind of impact that's going to have on growth, we don't really know yet, because we're just kind of at the beginning of this process.
Great. Thank you so much. I will make a question raised by our audience. It's a question from Renato Bauman. He is from the main research economic institute of Brazil, IPEA, and also member of the consultative committee of the Brazil-China Business Council. And his question is, apparently we are about to see a new Chinese revolution based on technology. What about the excess inventories of the China factory and the impact over international markets? And now I add, can we expect a backlash against this China strategy and an emergence of new trade tensions with Europe and the United States, and even with the global South? Who would like to take this one? Erlend.
Maybe I'll start. So yes, I think this is obviously from the Chinese side by design, excess capacity. But I don't like to use the word overcapacity, because usually these are future technologies. These are usually, like, take renewable energy, for instance. This is what the world needs. So there is no question that there is going to be a demand for the product. I think the question is poor quality. Domestically, the issue is poor quality production, which is a problem, that there are too many producers, there's been too much support and subsidies, and they're trying to deal with that problem domestically. Now, trade tension is very likely, obviously, when China is trying to introduce new products that is competing with traditional incumbent technologies. But China's strategy is quite simple, is that green and digital products are in demand all around the world. They want to be the best, they want to be the cheapest, they want to compete. Yeah, the trade tensions are likely. Governments are going to look into how China makes their products so competitive. I don't think it's only, some of that comes from, subsidizing energy consumption in China, but the more likely reaction is to the topic that we talked about before, is trying to welcome Chinese know-how, Chinese technologies, Chinese supply chains to the destination country, so China doesn't export everything. I don't think China in the end want to remain the global factory of the world, but they want to move on to become the innovator and the designer of the global trade. So that we are very likely to see increasing.
I will add as well that though I think Erlend basically covered it, we're already seeing the trade tension. I thought actually much more interesting than the EU probe on new energy vehicles that started some months ago is the new trade tensions that are occurring now with Brazil over especially steel and chemicals. I think that is a sign that the PRC's strategy of kind of this supply side focus, and we're going to build up the supply side so that we have the things that people will consume in 10 years when we are a rich country, it does have some consequences. And I actually think, to, I guess, provide some criticism, that the leadership and intellectuals in the PRC maybe haven't fully thought out this kind of the tensions that could rise from a country of the scale of the PRC, you know, 1.4 billion people becoming such an advanced manufacturing powerhouse, and the kind of effects that's going to have internationally. So that's definitely something to look at. But I believe because of the strategic thinking of the leadership, that negotiations with new partners are going to be able to kind of solve a lot of these tensions, at least with countries in the global south. I don't believe that'll be true with countries in Europe, for example, or the United States.
Thank you. Larissa, do you want to comment something? Okay. And Erlend, in your first response, you mentioned the relationship between the state and the markets. And the private sector in China had a very prominent role in the early decades of China reform and opening up, and has a very high contribution to innovation, to employment. But now there is a doubt about what is the role of the private sector now in this new Chinese economy. Can you tell us, how do you see it?
Right. It's a challenging question. No, I think that the way that the Chinese leadership look at the economy is through different dimensions. So obviously, the market has a very important role. The competition among enterprises in China is very real. I think most Chinese you meet will tell you about the very intense competition. And that's what the government like, because competition creates efficiency, right? So that is already present in many areas in China. Not all, not energy, for instance, not agriculture in many areas. But I think and when China started connecting to the global supply chains, they were introduced to a system that was already kind of carved out for them. But what we're seeing now is that China needs to change the rules of the game, and so we see that the government is taking a much bigger say in how to design the markets. And in addition to that, China now has a lot of capital, and I think that is very key. Like in the 90s, in the early 2000s, China didn't have the capital. They had to get it from abroad, and foreign investors usually wanted to invest in, obviously, private entities, maybe in partnerships with SOEs. But now China can contribute with that capital itself. So at the current stage, the role of foreign investment has changed quite a lot. China does not need the capital for the sake of capital. They need the foreign investors because foreign investors bring knowledge. They bring often markets abroad and so on. So I think that, and when it comes to private players in China, I don't think that it's too useful to distinguish too much between kind of private companies and SOEs anymore, because it's all owned by capital, like state capital. The banks are usually the one that give these companies the money, and they can at any time kind of direct these companies in the direction that they want. But we see that the state-owned enterprises are getting a clearer role as a supporter of strategic industries. Maybe Itamar, you want to add to this point?
Yeah, what I'll add to that, I think what you're trying to get at is that a lot of the difference in the evolution between the role of the private economy maybe 20 years ago and today is that the state is far more embedded in the economy today as a result of, we could really say, industrial policy and the kind of ways the state has used investment, as well as, like Erlend was talking about, the financial system, bank loans, in order to support certain industries. And this process actually has occurred overwhelmingly on the local level. You have cities like Hefei who have really pioneered this kind of equity-based fiscal system where the city is actually taking, purchasing equity shares in companies as a way of having them relocate manufacturing and research to the city and building a complete supply chain for certain products. And that has turned it into, one of the most widely acclaimed kind of development stories actually in the PRC over the last 20 years. So that's a big thing. Another, some more background I guess I would add is that, there is a lot of talk about the private economy lacking confidence. I think one of the reasons that a lot of measures show that private companies are doing poorly is because they are disproportionately represented in the real estate sector. Real estate developers, though there are a lot of SOEs as well, it was an industry that was, mostly comprised of private companies. So as that sector declines over the last 2 years, of course, these private companies are the ones who are going to be feeling the brunt the worst, especially because they have less access to financing compared to their state-owned rivals. So the last thing I'll say is that the leadership has been very clear that innovation is at the center of everything that they're doing today. And they have said this so many times, Erlend and I are basically talking about it every week, that firms are to lead in innovation, enterprises, right? So this is something that is really, really key to understanding how the leadership sees these companies' role. They love the nimbleness, they love the innovation of private companies, they believe in it, and they want to foster it. And the state wants to have a role where it is coordinating and assisting these companies, but allowing them to do most of the innovative work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, yes, of course.
Yeah, it calls my attention. Like it has to do also the question that Renato Baumann raised about what do you do with the excess capacity that you will have. I think China has some ideas about development models, economic development, that are very different from everything we normally see and we're used to. So that's why it makes it so hard to understand, so challenging, but also so interesting at the same time. And I think I have a feeling they have an ability to just let go because they have the sense that somehow like some things will not work, other things will work, and then in the end, the best companies will move on, and that will take the economy along. So that means that if you have excess capacity in some sectors, although you have a lot of state direction, somehow like the market will like decide on who are the best companies to stay afloat, right? And listening to Itamar and the example of Hefei, I think that's very interesting because I don't think we get much of this information here in Brazil, but city governments that have equity in companies. And as far as I know, there are other examples of city governments or some other provinces doing something similar. So they will choose a basket of possible investments of different companies that can be a target for their investments for different reasons, but mostly because they want to attract these companies to their location. They want a specific area to be developed there. And some of these investments will work and some others will not. And it's okay. So I think it's the experimentation aspect of this policy of economic development. It's very hard for us to understand and accept. And these two examples seem to me to be related.
Yes, yes. Erlend.
Maybe let me just add one quick point, is that so the competition on a city level or provincial level has been fierce for many years. And at the current stage, the central government is in the opinion that this competition is too fierce, and they now want to use the central government to coordinate better by raising standards across the board. So that's another role of the government, is to consult industry and then raise the bar for everyone. So there's always like playing at the higher level and not contributing to a race to the bottom. So that's something that is relatively new in terms of this industrial zones in China.
Okay, thank you. One more question from our audience is from Gabriel Cohen. How do you anticipate China's new industrial policy will be received by countries such as Brazil, which are wary of their own deindustrialization? And I would mention also Europe and the United States. So in the path of the question of the backlash, and how do you see this dynamic?
Let me start. So, I mean, the first that we see is that these countries are responding by looking at what China has been doing for 20 years and trying to learn from it. It's not easy, though. I mean, the European example is quite an interesting one. China is now threatening the automobile industry, really the heart of industrial policy in Europe. It contributes more than, I think, 15% of employment in Europe. It is not something that the EU is going to welcome, very much. But at the same time, the inability of European companies to respond by being competitive is not really China's fault. That is something that the European needs to deal with. Of course, they can protect themselves with trade barriers. But at the end of the day, the future that both Europe wants and the Chinese companies are responding to is electric vehicles. The problem in Europe is probably more in the field of energy policy, because if you want to create all these new factories needed for building the supply chains, you need to have energy supply, and that is the biggest problem in Europe. So they can't respond quickly enough. So at the moment, I think the current spat between China and Europe in the field of automobiles is going to end probably, like Itamar was saying before, is that there's going to be negotiations. And if China then committed to help Europe with their energy crisis, bring know-how, technologies, capital, you name it, that would be a likely solution. Now, would you welcome Chinese investment to Europe? Well, the answer there I think is probably going to be a mixed bag, because probably many countries are not going to welcome Chinese investment, but many underdeveloped or less developed countries are probably very eager to see Chinese investments. So this is obviously going to play into European politics as well. I leave it for the two others to respond to how this is going to play out in Brazil.
Well, I don't know how exactly it'll play out in Brazil. I'm sure all of you can answer that question even better. But I will say, I think from the perspective of the leadership, is they think that as they move up the value-added chain, that they are actually going to be sort of releasing downstream more industries than they'll be taking away. So I think there's a belief that they're actually going to create more investment opportunities and more, I guess, manufacturing opportunities in other countries as a result of this expanding supply chain versus any kind of competition that might occur. I think that is the logic. Whether it's true, only time will tell. You know, we're gonna have to see if it really is that true.
Mhm.
Yeah, I believe that Brazil has the opportunity to look at this from a different angle comparing to the US and Europe. Also because of not only our situation as a developing economy, but the fact that we're not really competing with China, right? So I think for us, um, it's more of an opportunity if we take it like the right way. Gabriel, who asked the question, I think is right in the sense that we do have a problem of losing our industries, but I think we have a lot of competitive advantages, especially related to energy, that we should be able to better explore, and that I think would be also would put Brazil in the map for investments related to these energy intensive industries from around the world. But then we really have to think how we're going to place ourselves in this discussion. And going back to my first point, do we want to make sure we will produce the solar panels, or do we want to focus on being able to offer cheap, clean energy and then attract the industries related to green hydrogen, for instance, right? And then, as Erlend said, Europe's biggest need is energy. Brazil can be a big supplier of energy to Europe as well, in some sense. But these investments, we can't like really solve all problems. But if you think about maritime fuels, for instance, or sustainable aviation fuels that have to be more spread out around the world, this is something that Brazil has a big potential to produce here. And those investments could be even partnerships of European with Chinese firms. Brazil has an example of energy production investment here in the gas-fired thermal power plant, where investors are European and American and Chinese. So we are able to like put this group of firms together, right? So sometimes it looks like they are geopolitics is playing such a big role that business cannot work together anymore. But I think we have to keep working to show that business can work and that we have to be pragmatic. Brazil's diplomacy has been very universal throughout its history, and I think in this case it can be very useful to reinforce Brazil's position as a country that can work together in a positive way with the two sides. So potentially we could have investments where this technology and this capital is placed in projects here so that we can be part of this uh, sorry, of this supply chain and also address our need to put our industry back on track.
Thank you, Larissa. We have a question from Tiago da Silva Selaibi. Is it possible that the Chinese government will allocate resources to high-tech sustainable agriculture within the context of new productive forces? And if yes, how this would affect Brazilian agriculture exports to China? Larissa, do you want to jump in?
Yes. The Chinese government is very concerned about increasing productivity in their agricultural areas. But we all know it is a very challenging situation for them. They lack water resources and they also lack agricultural land. So it's always a struggle between like what do you do with the land you already have? Like, do you further develop it or do you focus on agricultural land? And the Chinese government has a policy to be self-reliant in some of the key agricultural items that they need the most: rice, corn, and wheat. And soybean has been accepted as a product that needs to be imported, although they try to increase the production of soybeans, and they have been successful. In some years, it's really impressive that they have been able to increase their soybean production, but it's always at the limit, and it is very hard to see them really incrementing their productivity gains in a way that Brazil would be, let's say, less necessary in terms of its supply of agricultural goods. There are a lot of improvements China can make. They are trying to, for instance, use less fertilizers, less pesticides, but they also have to convince the Chinese farmer that he can do that without losing income, which is it's a model that they have been using for decades, like lots of fertilizers, lots of pesticides, and then that ensures some basic income, like some basic productivity, and therefore some basic income that the Chinese government seems to me is having some trouble to convince farmers that they can use less and still have those productivity gains. That being said, China is making efforts on this regard, and I think there are improvements to be made. I think because of the continuous growth in income and the fact that you still have a lot of people in the rural areas potentially moving into the urban areas, even if not at the same speed we've seen before, this change will probably lead them into further diversifying their diet and the need to have suitable supply of animal protein, and therefore animal feed, so they can produce this animal protein. And that's where Brazil fits into. Brazil is supplying the feed, animal feed, that will lead into the production of animal protein. We also provide China with animal protein, especially beef. That's the most important product directly, but soybean is our biggest agricultural export. So what I'm mostly concerned about when China expresses their discomfort with being so reliant on importing these goods, and especially importing from a few countries, because only a few countries can produce at this scale as Brazil can, and all the geopolitical conflicts that they might have with some of the other potential suppliers like the United States, is that China will be led into further trying to work with other partners to develop their agricultural potential. So we have other countries in the world, like Russia and like the countries in the African continent, that could improve their agricultural potential. It's not easy, it's not from day to night, but they could if they wanted. Russia has already made big progress in improving their agricultural production. It's a matter of dedication to it, of wanting to do it, and that makes me more concerned than China itself increasing its productivity gains to a level that they would not need Brazil anymore. But I can see Erlend would like to comment on that too.
Yeah, Erlend.
Yeah, I will not go too deep into this, but I think a major point of what Larissa is talking about is price also, that China wants in the short term, China wants to have ability to impact the price more. And the problem is really on the Chinese side, because they're keeping the agriculture price very low. So, which doesn't really make the system very innovative, efficient, and so on. But one thing I want to say is that recently, or last year, the portfolio for innovation or technological development in China was moved from the Minister of Science and Technology to the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. So the Ministry of Agriculture is now in charge of making use of this new productive forces and try to solve the fundamental technical issues and implement, try to develop systems that take advantage of big data, AI, drones, and so on. So we're probably going to see a lot of tech efforts to become quite innovative in the agriculture tech area. But the fundamental, of course, issue in China is the production, and like Larissa said, the water, land, pricing issues are going to stay with us. So imports is here to stay, obviously.
I think that just about covers it. I will add that last year the PRC did approve GMO crops for the first time. So they are showing kind of a willingness to adopt new technologies as they're trying to increase production.
Thank you. Thank you. And one area of vulnerability for China when the country tries to make this movement to new technology is semiconductors. China still does not produce high-end semiconductors, and now it's subjected to sanctions from the United States that restrict its access to these high-end semiconductors. How big a hurdle is that for China? Is it a real problem? And there is a question from Milton de Mello. What are the Chinese plans regarding the semiconductor industry?
Well, let me go first, Itamar. We have a colleague who is a real expert on this. So what I'm saying is repeating what I've learned from him. But yeah, so China doesn't produce the highest end, but they do produce high-end chips. And today, most applications use these kind of devices. So the question is, what about the future? And we don't really know the application scope of these highest. Do you need the highest end chips for all industries? What kind of percentage? How that is going to affect kind of your ecosystem? And the other question is, of course, will China be able to produce this in the future? And there's, of course, a lot of efforts. Now, our sense, I think, and Itamar might jump in here, is that they are not too far behind. They have put in a lot of effort, a lot of money. It so far seems quite wasted. They have admitted that they failed. But there are a lot of companies, a lot of people working in this field in China. A lot of them are working in laboratories around the world, in the US, Europe, other countries. And China obviously want this to come back and teach them the latest. Now, I think it's just a matter of time before China becomes successful in this field as well. The question is by that time, how far will the frontier be? Will the US continue to be able to be a few years ahead? That seems likely right now, but I think there's a lot of uncertainties here.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Erlend. We have to remember that this sector in particular is one that they've been investing just enormous sums of money for almost a decade now. I think, when was the semiconductor industry fund created? Like, was it 2015 or 2016? Yeah, somewhere around there. So almost a decade now. And they've had a lot of failures that a lot of people have identified. But again, the perspective of the leadership, this supply side perspective, this new productive forces perspective, is that all those failures don't matter if they lead to the one company that succeeds, right? If they're able to create just one company that can secure their own supply chain, right? Or that section of the supply chain. We know the semiconductor supply chain is very long. It's one of the most, one of the longest supply chains of any product we have. But they have investments in basically companies at every single point. And a lot of them have shown a lot of promise. So, the big one that everyone was talking about is late last year, Huawei came out with its new, I think it was the Mate 60. And that had a, a 7-nanometer Kirin chip in it made by SMIC, which is a Chinese company that has received billions, tens of billions in both direct and indirect support from the state. And a lot of people were talking about, well, it's dead-end technology. There were a lot of criticisms of the chip, but at the end of the day, from their perspective, Huawei announced that, they plan on shipping maybe 20, 30 million devices this year. So, I mean, that means that they believe that the production capacity is already there. So they are behind technologically, right? But the kind of advances they have made over the last just 5 years are enormous. And another thing that's really important to remember, as well as my colleague was talking about, is that for the grand majority of products, you don't need the highest end chips, and the amount of capacity they have coming online just over the next 2 years is massive. It's just massive. So we're going to start seeing, the grand majority of the world's chips coming from the PRC because of the price advantage. And that is going to even further change global supply chains. And I think it's kind of a secular trend that no matter how much the United States tries to restrict this industry in the PRC, it won't be able to because of the fundamental economics.
Thank you. Itamar, in your presentation, you made reference to the decrease of foreign direct investment in China last year. No, if I'm not mistaken, it reached the lowest mark in 30 years. And with growing protectionism and nationalism, deglobalization, and the US-China rivalry, will Beijing be able to lure foreign investments again? And what kind of measures Beijing needs to adopt to be successful in this endeavor?
Yes. This is, I think, one of the biggest questions right now facing the PRC, which is what kind of role are foreign firms and foreign investment going to have in the economy moving forward? Because the fundamentals have really changed. Since reform and opening up, foreign investment had two kind of main, foreign direct investment, I should say, had really two main pathways. You had multinationals who would create production facilities so they could sell to the PRC market. Those are, all the joint ventures that we saw in everything from automobiles to appliances. And then we also had manufacturers setting up shop to export to the rest of the world. Now, in the first category, because of the intense competition from domestic competitors, that kind of pathway isn't as available to foreign firms anymore, because the likelihood that they are able to beat a domestic competitor in a certain product is relatively low. There are a lot of exceptions. I don't want to say that's impossible. And the PRC has made it very clear that they want these companies to come and to try to be competitive, and that they're going to work to remove restrictions against them. Now, have all of those restrictions been removed? No, because many of them are at the local level and it is hard to dislodge them, right? Now, the second one about companies coming in and manufacturing for other countries, this is still available, but it has also taken a hit because the wages have risen significantly in the PRC, especially over the last 15, 20 years. And there are other companies in the same region, other countries in the same region, like Vietnam, for example, Indonesia, that are more competitive price-wise. So, and then you have also, the equity holdings of foreign investors and how those have been also leaving the PRC, though I think that has more to do with the difference in interest rates between the rest of the world and the PRC. The PRC right now has some of the lowest interest rates in the world. And so investors want their money outside of it where it can bring them more returns. So there's a lot of kind of headwinds right now in the global economy that are making it hard for us to know if kind of this is a new normal, that foreign investment is going to leave the PRC. But I will say that from what we see, how the leadership is acting, that they do have an understanding that the previous sources of foreign direct investment, which mostly came from countries like Japan, Taiwan, Europe, and the United States, those are not going to be around the way they were in the past. And I think that's why we see a lot of movement of trying to get, for example, Gulf state sovereign wealth funds to invest in the PRC. There's basically all of the Gulf states have open offices. Their sovereign wealth funds have open offices in the PRC over the last 3 years. And they're planning to, I think Saudi Arabia alone is planning, maybe $1 trillion in investments before 2030. So this is definitely a place where they see a lot of capital coming in. And they're looking increasingly towards, we could say, the global south. So I think there's a lot of investment opportunities for Brazilian companies, for example. Brazil, many people don't, all of you know it, but a lot of people in the rest of the world don't know it, is you have some really large and strong and competitive companies. And I think that there's going to be more opportunities for them to invest in the PRC, especially because of the geopolitical situation where the PRC knows that it needs new partners.
Yeah, to finish, we are almost reaching our end of the webinar. And to finish it, a question for the three too. What might be the impact for United States-China relation and to China relations with the rest of the world of a Donald Trump victory in November election in the US?
Okay, I guess I should take this because I'm from the United States.
Yes.
I think really, I've gotten this question actually from other business leaders in other countries. So this is definitely something a lot of people are thinking about. I think the leadership believes that the problems it has with the United States are fundamentally structural. And I don't think they believe there will be a huge difference between a potential Trump and a potential Biden administration. And I think that's mostly because a lot of the most difficult policies that the Trump administration implemented were continued by the Biden administration. And actually, a lot of the strictest policies, I'm thinking, for example, the October 2022 restrictions on advanced industries like AI and semiconductors. That was the Biden administration who did that. So I think from the leadership's perspective, they shouldn't expect much of a difference. But of course, Trump says all kinds of things. He says he's going to put a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods. Well, that is going to completely restructure the global economy if that really happens. So we will see. But I think the leadership is just trying to continue the path and take a more structural approach.
Let me add just on this matter of uncertainty, because I think it already plays a big role in how not only China, but the whole world is kind of preparing for that scenario. Of course, with Trump, and let me just say that Itamar's point on the immediate economic impact is probably not going to be challenged too much, although additional tariffs might, accelerate certain processes. But I think on these longer term issues, Trump would obviously create much more uncertainty. Last time he pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, for instance. So that is obviously this constructive kind of dialogues. Although there's a lot of tension, although there are a lot of disagreements, at least the current state is that you have these discussions. The climate is probably the best example, although I think already last year in Dubai at the climate summit, China was very well aware that the US position might be totally changed this year or early next year. So of course they do not want to compromise their position if the US is giving them something, and that is creating an interesting dynamic. And of course, we need to reassess if Trump gets elected, but he will bring obviously much more uncertainty into this, both short term or somewhat short term, but more over the longer term issues that the world is now facing, especially climate change.
I'll just go to Erlend's point and emphasize that climate for Brazil is really an opportunity, because even if Trump gets elected, I think what Brazil can do and should do is to probably keep its historic position of being pragmatic, being open to talking to everyone, having good relations, and focusing on its biggest needs as a developing country. So what are the partners that will help us address the needs we have to face, the problems, the issues we have here? And we have many, right? We have infrastructure deficit, we have sanitation deficit, we have the need to bring in investors that can look into these capital intensive industries. So I think Brazil should keep its stance so that it is not the current relations are not too much changed. But I think climate is a key issue where Brazil has a leading position as well. We'll be hosting the next COP meeting, and not the next one, but the COP 30 meeting in Belém in Pará State. That's very important. We don't know what will be the result of the election. By then, the situation might be different than it is today. However, I think the partnership that Brazil can have with China in this regard is very important, and would be something quite important for when Brazil takes on the presidency of the COP 30 meeting.
Thank you, Larissa. Well, unfortunately, we reached the end of our webinar. Professor Wang had difficulties in connecting, in spite of all the technological advancement in China. He was not able to connect. Hope he will be with us in another opportunity. I'd like to thank Larissa for being with us and for the partnership. Thank you, Erlend and Itamar. It was great. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience also learned a lot. And I think it would be fascinating to follow this transformation of the Chinese economy. And I think a lot of countries, including Brazil, have a lot to learn from the Chinese experience. So I pass the floor to Ambassador Luis Augusto de Castro Neves, President of CEBC, to make the ending remarks. Ambassador. Ambassador, you are muted.
Thank you, Claudia. I would like very much to include myself in the thanking of Erlend and Itamar and Larissa for their useful participation in our webinar. And before saying goodbye, I would like to mention that the title of this webinar, Decoding Beijing's Plans, Expectations for the Chinese Economy, is about also trying to find out what are, if there are, windows of opportunity for the Brazilian economy in improving and deepening, strengthening the relationship with China, which has been a very splendid over the last 20 years, I would say. But I also come to the conclusion that it is up to us, it is up to our initiative, Brazilian initiative, to be able to fully avail itself of the windows of opportunity produced by the Chinese economy, by China in these days. It's not up to them, but up to us to prepare ourselves to be competitive in China. Well, having said that, I would like to thank you once again, and I hope to be able to meet you again in the near future. And the Brazil-China Business Council and the CEBC, the Brazilian Center for International Relations, would thank you very much once again. Thank you, Larissa. Thanks, Itamar. Thanks, Erlend. And goodbye.